Blossom and Blade. Written by Akito B. Takahashi. Narrated by Caitlin Harris.
Chapter 1. Fangs don't come in cotton candy, but my hair does. You're probably wondering who that pink-haired girl wearing a black dress running down the city is? That's me, Charlette Orpheus. Well, that's actually the name I adopted a couple hundred years ago. As for why I'm running down the streets of Manhattan, New York, it's because I'm being chased by a vampire hunter. He called himself Raven when we first met, and I have this dreadful feeling that he's going to catch up to me and kill me soon. The year's 2024. I stare at the moon high in the sky from my lavish penthouse at the topmost floor. It's calming up here around this time of night. The city's still bustling with cab drivers and others still awake at this hour. Perhaps ordinary people couldn't be able to see the vast number of stars in the night sky due to the amount of light produced from the billboards, but I can. Because I'm a vampire. My visual acuity is far superior than ordinary people. They're like magnifying glasses, only they're not affected by LED lights. But why am I explaining to you about what a vampire can and can't do? Everyone's seen enough movies to know about vampires. They've become the latest trend ever since that grueling romance movie about a vampire boy and a wolf who fondle over the same girl. I already wish I hadn't brought it up. So, why would a vampire like me choose to live in a place like New York City? It's simple. There are so many people here that no one has the time of day to really pay attention to who's walking by. Mix that with how easy it is for me to get from one place to another, and I'd say it's a perfect hideaway for vamps. 200 years ago, I was drawn to this handsome man with blonde curly hair and sharp red eyes. He seemed to be infatuated with me until he bit me one night and turned me into his likeness. I was scared at first, asking him why he hadn't told me who he truly was. His reason was because he was looking for a mate to spend all eternity with. In my day, vampires were regarded as Satan's children. They still are, of course. I liked him, yes, but I wasn't in love with him. Turning me into a vampire was more than enough of a reason to break things off. I was scared, nervous, and saddened at how my 29-year-old life turned into a cold, blood-sucking wreck. So when I ran away from him, he simply let me go to fend for myself. Things were hard at first. The vampire that turned me watched from the shadows as I almost died from refusing to suck people's blood. I felt a hunger so insatiable that nothing except for blood could quench it. A fresh carcass of a dead raccoon was thrown to me as I laid flat against the ground. "Eat it," he said from the dark. "Otherwise, you'll die." I was technically already dead, but not wishing to feel this hunger pain any longer, I ate the carcass as if it were my last meal. It tasted delicious, like I was biting into a well-marinated steak that was just cooked to perfection. After that night, I clung onto the person that had turned me. He was all I had. Months had gone by with him teaching me all about myself. There were times that he'd tried to advance on me, but I still held a deep resentment toward him for having turned me without permission. And he knew it, too. Perhaps my worst moment with him was when he forced me to slaughter a small town out of pleasure. That terrible plan backfired when some of the townsfolk took revenge. They discovered our hideout where they captured him. I managed to get away just in the nick of time, fleeing the area for good. It was the first time I would be traveling alone. What's more was that it was also the last time I had ever seen him again. The things he taught me were the basics. As a vampire, we're animated corpses that recall events from our past life. Now unrestricted by the boundaries that set man apart from other creatures, we're now capable of performing supernatural feats. It's nothing special, though. Minor things like augmented strength, increased speed and agility, and enhanced senses. There are also other things we could do. One was to transform into a bat and place people under a trance, making it easier to feed. Apart from all those perks, there's really nothing special about being a vampire. Sure, we can withstand sunlight for a certain period of time before our skin starts to boil, but it's really not all that astonishing. For instance, I get bored a lot more than I used to. After living in Pennsylvania for some time, if I hadn't discovered other vampires like myself, I would have gone insane. The second vamp I met during that time was a woman named Evelyn Noir. All jokes aside, she was actually very heartwarming. Known as a coven, vampires had managed to build their own society among the living. Quite the conspiracy, if you ask me. Evelyn introduced me to her coven. I was laughed at for not knowing the rules. But when I told them my situation, they ridiculed the vamp who hadn't explained how the vamp world functioned. First rule, we're not allowed to share the true nature of the vampire race. We're to masquerade the existence of vampires by whatever means necessary. That means hiding, feeding only when it's safe, and staying away from public eyes. By keeping our society a secret, we'll increase our lineage. Second rule, respect other vampire domains. There are quite a lot of vampires in the world. Most of them are stationed in Europe, but some have transmigrated to the United States. If you find yourself in someone else's domain, you're to abide by their rules. None may challenge that vampire's hunting ground. Third rule, we're not allowed to turn people into vampires without permission from a senior vampire. The person who turned me broke that rule because he was looking for love. Go figure. If someone breaks that rule, it results in both the sire and their progeny being slain. Had I not already been a vampire for 50 years before meeting Evelyn and learning to control myself, her coven would have slain me on the spot. Fourth rule, if you turn someone over with permission, they become your children. They are to follow your steps, and you are to teach them until they learn to control themselves. As disgusting as vampires are made out to be, they're surprisingly well-mannered amongst themselves. Except for one thing, Nosferatu. This was the term coined after a vamp in Germany lost his sanity. When this happens after uncontrolled feeding, our bodies become disfigured, and we lose all sense of rationality. We lose what makes us who we are and become no different than ravenous animals. Apart from dying again, it's the worst thing that can happen to us. Depending on how you look at it, things aren't all bad. We don't need to sleep, nor do we need to breathe. Perhaps the craziest thing I did was sit underwater for a few days just to see what would happen. My body had become so pruned that I looked like an old woman. Worst decision ever. It took me days to fully recover from that. I forgot to mention that part. We have regenerative abilities. As long as our head's not cut off and we're not impaled in the heart with something like a wooden cross, we could regrow an injured body part. The time varies depending on how severe the injury is. Those are all the things I know about being a vampire. No special tricks, no gimmicky features like mind reading, and no superpowers like flying without transforming. Never met a vamp that had superpowers. That was at least in my 200 years of walking on the face of the earth. After Evelyn became the leader of her coven, she moved us to New York on account of how easy it was to thrive there. The decision paid off well. At Manhattan, a lot of us jumped into the stock market before companies like Berkshire Hathaway skyrocketed. With all the money we made, we secretly built lodges and all sorts of buildings that were specific to our needs. And they wonder why they call this place the city that never sleeps. Things were looking well for our coven of 9 vamps. That is, until our oldest member made public headlines about his age. In the mid-1900s, the media had innovated so much that the entire world was receiving news from everywhere across the nation. Something like a man looking like he was still in his 30s, despite 70 years going by, had caught people's attention. Because of that, Evelyn had no other choice but to leave New York. I, not wishing to take the limelight during that time, hadn't wanted to leave. She respected my decision before handing over the coven's assets to me. It, of course, came with a condition. After 7 decades, she'd return with everyone to once again take over New York. Things weren't easy for me at first, but I managed to conceal my identity twice in 2 different generations. It was all while leading a top hedge fund company called Millennium Management. I'm sure the reference was understood. And I could have been number 1 if I wanted to. Sadly, Bridgewater Associates held that position. News articles think we have a net worth of $57 billion. It's truly $248 billion. That was twice the amount Bridgewater had. By staying awake all night and sneaking into other hedge fund companies' offices, I was able to gather more than enough information needed to invest in the best stocks. Perhaps my best work was when I shorted a company's stock just before anonymously sending their insider trading scandal to the FBI. My employees thought I was crazy until they saw their dividends almost quadruple overnight. I love those guys. Most of them are my afternoon snacks during lunch break. I should have mentioned that feeding has become a lot easier over the years. Whether I was visiting blood banks to take their freshest supplies or placing my employees under a trance to feed, I had never once been caught. My preferences were rich businessmen with a bit of a hue to them. Their blood was rich enough to last me a few days before needing to feed again. Once the bell rang, signifying the market was closed for the day, I'd either take a limousine home or run at full speed on foot if I didn't feel like waiting. At home, I'd reply to all my emails and then report to Evelyn. Technology had advanced so fast that I no longer had to travel halfway across the country to visit her in California. She had taught me a few tricks to help disguise my identity. The first was to apply enough makeup to make it seem as if I were aging. Afterwards, I was to take long vacations. This made the people around me think I was getting too old for the job. Once the time came, I would have my quote-unquote relative take my position. A new name, a new hairstyle, mixed with a different pair of contact lenses to hide my red eyes, and I was ready to be shown to the public again. That's actually why I dyed my hair pink. It was so unprejudiced that the conservative journalist found no reason to investigate me. Little had I known that a man named Raven would be the only person in the world to think a woman sporting pink hair was truly a vampire. Fast forward a little to the present, and we're right back to staring at the moon atop my lavish penthouse. It wasn't the fact that I couldn't sleep even if I tried. It was Raven's arrival at my office yesterday that kept me up until the sun finally rose.
Wish to read along while you listen? Be sure to follow us on our social media platform for the latest news.